talk. Since I know we're streaming, I'm Freya Hartzell. I'm an assistant professor here at the Bard Graduate Center in Modern Design History, and it's my great pleasure to introduce to you today my friend and colleague, Professor Christopher Long. Dr. Long is University Distinguished Teaching Professor of Architectural and Design History at the University of Texas at Austin. And after studying at the universities of Graz, Vienna, and Munich, he received his doctorate at the University of Texas at Austin. And over the course of his career, Dr. Long has worked as a cultural historian, an art historian, historian of architecture and design, and his scholarship really continues to explore disciplinary and conceptual intersections. He's the author of numerous books and articles on a wide variety of topics in American and European architecture and design, and they are so numerous, he is so prolific, that it's not only staggering to me as somebody who's at the beginning of her publishing career, but too numerous titles to list them, so I won't do that. I will let him talk instead. Today, he's going to share with us material from his forthcoming book on the German-born architect and designer Jock Peters, who was among the leading modernists working in Southern California in the 1920s and 30s. His presentation will explore not only aspects of Peters' life and career, but also suggest to us reasons for the architect's exclusion from standard modernist histories, which he argues open up important questions about historiography and the establishment of meaning in the study of modern design. So please help me welcome Chris Long.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you first to Laura for arranging this, and also to Freya for having me here. It's a nice opportunity to come back to Bard. I was here quite some years ago, more than I'd remembered. Marion just reminded me how long ago that was since I was last at Bard. But anyway, I'm delighted to be back in your new remade digs, because I remember half of this building from before and not the whole thing. I want to speak to you about a project I'm working on now. It's a book project. It's a monograph. I started this project roughly 4 years ago, and I came to it in that way that one often comes to books. I was in an archive looking for something else and stumbled on some material. At the time, I was writing my book on Kem Weber, and I had noted in the catalog that there was some material related to Jock Peters. So in one lazy afternoon, when I didn't feel like actually looking at Kem Weber material, I pulled up what was on Jock Peters, and I found there was some material, not enough, I thought, for a book, but some interesting material. I didn't know much about Jock Peters. I suspect those of you who know anything about Jock Peters effectively know that he was the designer for Bullock's Wilshire in 1929, the interiors. Is that what you would know, or do you know anything? Very, very little. Obviously, he was an important figure in the Los Angeles scene. It's the one project of his that's often depicted in books or discussed in works on California modernism, so it's what he's known for. I made some inquiries and found out that the Peters family was very much around, that in the end there was a surviving son, as it turned out at the time, who I managed to interview literally 2 days before he died. Which is pretty fortuitous. He told me some very interesting things about his father. His grandson had the remainder of the archive and was living at that time on top of a mesa south of Durango, Colorado. Really literally in the middle of almost nowhere, not quite, but close. And so I arranged to go up with my wife to Durango and go through the archive. And Gia and I, my wife, and some chipmunks, because there were a number of chipmunks running around inside these locker storage spaces, went through the material. And what I discovered was something really pretty remarkable. A very interesting story both about German modernism and American modernism. The narrative I'll recount to you here in a moment. And then I want to come back and I want to suggest some issues that I'm having as an author currently, and also some historiographic problems that maybe we can discuss. Because I understand that my role here is to talk for half an hour or so and then for us to discuss. So you see here Jock Peters as he was around 1931 in a photograph from Brett West. And Brett Weston, as somebody you may know, is the son of the more famous Weston, also a very good photographer in his own right. As I was digging through these, I found dozens of photographs by the Westons, both of them, which the family did not give me, as you can imagine. I ended up, by the way, with a good chunk of this archive because the grandson passed away in October of this year, and they gave me the archive, which will eventually, at least part of the archive at least, which will eventually go to UCSB, which is where the rest of the archive is. The short story is that Jock Peters was born, as you can see here, in 1889 in a small farming village in the very far north of Germany near the Danish border. His family lost the farm when he was about 10. They moved to Hamburg, which is the next largest city. He grew up in Hamburg. He was apprenticed to a stonemason. When he finished that after 3 years, the story very much, if you think about it, like the young Mies van der Rohe's, right? Stonemason's apprentice. He decided that he wanted to be an architect, and eventually went first to night school and then eventually worked for an architect in Dusseldorf, was admitted to the architecture school there, finished his architecture degree, taught briefly in Essen in a school that eventually became the Folkwangschule, a very famous institution in the 1920s and 1930s. He was one of the first people to teach in that school, and then went back to Hamburg. And in Hamburg, he was working in the redevelopment of the inner city in an area called the Kontorhausviertel. Some of you who may know Hamburg know this area. They tore down a whole area. There had been a big cholera epidemic in Hamburg in 1892. They tore down the whole center of the city in this area and began to rebuild it. You can see one of his sketches. Buildings, of course, were built very much in the language, the form language that was popular in Germany in 1909, 1910, which is a kind of merging of Hanseatic Gothic, proto-functionalism, and in some measure kind of revived Biedermeier form language. You can see in the eyebrow windows at the very top, right? So it's a combination of all of those things. So neoclassicism meets Gothic, meets a kind of proto-functionalist vocabulary. He was working at this point for an architect named Benzel, not a well-known figure, I suspect, to any of you. It wasn't a known name to me, but it turned out he was a very important figure in early Hamburg architecture. Together they took part in a competition for a power plant in Hamburg called Tiefstock. And this is Peters' rendering of part of the Tiefstock complex from 1914. And what should jump out to all of us, I suspect, is the extent to which we can already see the impacts of Expressionism. This is remarkably early for architecture, and particularly for Hamburg, which was a place not really in the center of German modernist efforts in this period, 1914. Peters was drafted. He ended up, because he had TB, and that's an interesting part of our story, being assigned to a munitions plant in Belgium. He didn't go to the front. This is a rendering he did in 1915, also very much influenced by Expressionism, looks a little like Bad Sheila to me, of a sort of war weariness or angst from that period, not so atypical for German drawing of the time. But what he worked on mostly in 1916 and 1917 were a series of visionary projects for houses. And I show you these because they're so remarkable. This is actually obviously only a piece of one of these houses. But what we're looking at here is glazing. Glazing very much in the modern way, without mullions, held together with clips, set into a kind of portico, twin-column portico. He also drew wonderfully, beautifully the interior of this. And this idea of pure glazing, like this is really a quite remarkable thing for 1916, 1917. You can see how promising he was as an architect. What's notable, of course, is the extent to which there are still classical influences. The columns very much are a kind of attenuated, leftover Biedermeier aesthetic. But the interior suggests something completely different, which is the dissolving, or the beginning of the idea of dissolving inside and outside. And that's unusual for German architecture of this period when we consider that it's another 3 years before Mies begins to think about the possibilities of glass curtain walls. So this is quite prescient and quite interesting. It's also worth noting that right before Peters went off to the front, he found a position working for Peter Behrens in Berlin. So he actually worked for Behrens for not quite a year. And whether this has something to do with his time with Behrens, it's unclear, because Behrens' work is certainly much more muscular, much more robust, certainly much less absorbed with this idea of dissolving the wall. But then Peters went in another direction entirely altogether. In 1917, he drew another version of the same house project, interestingly, which is on the one hand wonderfully expressionist. In fact, it looks very much like the front of the Bauhaus catalog. And yet, of course, we're looking at some kind of funny Frank Lloyd Wright that's been picked up and dropped into a garden in Hamburg, which is where I think this was for. Indeed, it's a kind of weird version of the Roby house, if you think about it, right? Sort of truncated Roby house, which oddly, on the other starts to almost look like a Usonian house. In other words, he was more Wrightian than Wright in that sense by this time, because Wright certainly hadn't come to the Usonian idea this early. But very interesting, and the thing that's extraordinary for my eye is someone who works in the language of Expressionism, then in the language of this idea of dissolving interior and exterior with a sort of classicism, then moves over to Neo-Wrightian vocabulary. Then, well, right after the war, when he goes back to Hamburg, he does this for a Lustschloss, or pavilion on this Ulster in Hamburg. And he makes something that on the one hand looks very much like, well, what Gropius had done just before the war at the shoe factory, to which he added this wonderful tent-like structure in the center, and sort of very typical expression, especially North German expressionist detailing in bas-reliefs. All very odd as a grouping. But wait, there's more. Because for his own apartment, he installed this furniture, which is on the one hand, well, clearly expressionist, and expressionist in that way that sort of, there's a kind of mystical expressionism that was so typical of the early post-war era. But then look at the turning of this leg. It should be said that at this period he was working for Fritz Höger in Hamburg, so the famous designer of the Chile house. You know, everyone knows there's that giant expressionist thing in central Hamburg, right? So again, this idea of playing with mass. And then he went on to, well, be influenced by Mendelssohn. Except this isn't Mendelssohn, this is Jock Peters, experimenting with what it means to work with Mendelssohnian forms. And then he did this. This was his entry with another Danish architect for the Chicago Tribune competition. And mind you, everything I just showed you, at least the last 4 images, were done within a 3.5-year period. This is extraordinary. Really extraordinary. By the way, this is actually, I think, if they had submitted it, would have been one of the rather better entries to the Tribune competition. And in characteristic modesty, they didn't submit it because they weren't really sure what it was that Americans wanted. But there it is. By this time, by the early 1920s, Peters had left working for Höger and was the director of the School of Arts and Crafts, the Kunstgewerbeschule in Altona, just across the river from Hamburg. He did that for a year and a half, and then his health started to get worse and worse. He had had TB rather seriously since the teens. He had a younger brother, who was living in Los Angeles, who wrote to him and said, why don't you come to Los Angeles? The air is clean, everybody's building things. And so he took leave, I think, thinking that he might go back to Hamburg. And as soon as he got to Los Angeles, he thought, this is great, and had his family come after him. In Los Angeles, of course, initially he found the kind of work that young architects can find, which is to work for someone else or work on their own. In this case, he was working for an architect, a German architect named Otto Neher, not a particularly important architect, and he was moonlighting doing house designs for builders. And this is one of them. It's a house design in Pasadena. I haven't been able to find it, so I don't think it was built. But very typical mission revival, Spanish colonial revival. And so you look at it really carefully, and then you'll notice that there's some very odd things about it. For example, an Egyptian-style trapezoidal door set into here, or the way in which the whole house is recessed. At this point. It's actually kind of a lovely thing. And by the way, it's worth noting that we've also, at this point, seen about 6 different rendering styles. Right? Also really quite extraordinary. I mean, this is almost Japanese. Right? If you look at the way this is rendered. Well, of course, he ran into Lloyd Wright, so he thought Lloyd was really interesting, so he experimented with Lloyd Wright's forms. Around 1922, 1923. This was also not built. He had a house up in Eagle Rock, which is essentially the north part of Pasadena, if you know the Los Angeles area. And among the photographs that I found in the archive were some pictures of some of the furnishings that his brother was a building contractor, so he was quite good with a saw. And he built this thing that looks, well, a little like Green and Green, a little sort of Japanese and sort of curiously a little expressionist all at the same time, as if you could put all of those things in a cocktail shaker and shake them up. And if you poured it out, you would get something akin to this. He eventually went to work for, in 1923, he went to work for famous Players Lasky, the film company that became Paramount Pictures. Among the projects he worked on was this one for a film. It was called City of the Future. And so they were going to build an entire city of the future. You can see his rendering. This, by the way, is probably 5 feet long and 3.5 feet tall, all done in chalk. It's an absolutely stunningly beautiful thing. In a form language, I think that would be very familiar to Gothamites, right? Certainly that. The project was suspended in early 1925 when word came out that UFA was working on Metropolis. And so they never filmed it. Remarkably. But Peters went on to do a number of other projects for famous Players Lasky, including another project that was never filmed for something called A Princess on Mars. And so we see the transportations hub in Mars. This is also on the other side, the far side is the power plant. And a quite extraordinary rendering from that period. If you consider this is 1925, there are elements here, obviously, of constructivism, futurism, expressionism, and so forth. We can pretty much find almost every ism in here, I suspect, from the early part of the period. And yet, it is something distinctively different, because I wonder if for any of you this looks entirely familiar. Yes? No? Not exactly, right? Didn't to me when I pulled the drawing out of the box. I think, well, this is interesting because I've not quite seen this before. Even better is the elevator central point. You go down elevators that look like this. They're sort of shafts to go through. You get sucked up like a pneumatic tube system, apparently. And you can see the costumes for the Mars people in the background. I love this. Right? I think this is still Fashion Week, right? It's be perfect for Fashion Week. But extraordinary rendering, and even more extraordinary because one looks through the ceiling and sees the building above. It's a very, very unusual way of rendering an interior perspective where one actually reads through the building to the upper part. Really, really remarkable, I would say. This, too, alas, was not filmed. Peters instead left famous Players Lasky, and he and his brother went into business as designers of modern furniture. At this point, by the way, he was signing all of his drawings with some weird Ankh thing that he had developed, his own Ankh, which included some odd bit of expressionism on the other side. And what were they making? Well, things like this, which again looks a bit Asian. It's certainly not unrelated to the kind of puzzle forms that Paul Frankel was making in New York in that period. This is about the right time, 1927. It's not unrelated to what's left over from arts and crafts from that time, and also from East Asian design. They apparently did remarkably poorly with this because the firm went out of business rather quickly, though he did produce a number of rather interesting pieces, including, as far as I know, one of the very first examples of an interior canvas seat piece like this that's slung over a chair. I don't know of an earlier one for an interior. This is a good place for decorative artists to tell me if they know of an earlier one, but I'm not familiar with one that might be earlier than this. It's also not unrelated, for example, perhaps just because I wrote a book about Ken Weber, but it's not unrelated to, for example, the airline chair, which is a somewhat similar idea, something that sits over a frame in that way. He also worked on, this is a wonderfully prolific man, and mind you, I'm only showing you a tiny percentage of what I have. He worked on something called Universal Assembling Furniture, an idea he might have gotten from Schindler, because Schindler was interested in unit furniture in this period, as you may know. And the idea here is that there would be standard pieces, including a box-like piece on the bottom, and then you could simply stack them in any mode you wanted. He sent these off. These are actually the ones he sent to be copyrighted, and he managed to get a copyright for this, which is very unusual in 1928 because typically you couldn't copyright things like this. You could only copyright systems. You can actually copyright the forms, but you can copyright the system. This also was spectacularly unsuccessful. He tried to sell it to a number of different producers with no luck whatsoever. And so he started working part-time for a local interior design firm that worked with the leading modernists. And one of the first projects he got, albeit not the first project, was to do the interiors for Bullock's Wilshire. Bullock's, of course, was the largest retailer in downtown Los Angeles in this period, actually the largest retailer west of the Mississippi. And they decided to build a new store out in West Los Angeles where all the action was. And so they spent an inordinately large amount of money on this store on Wilshire Boulevard and what became the Miracle Mile. This is one of the anchor buildings in the Miracle Mile. And Peters was assigned the task of doing the 2 lower floors. So some of the upper floors were done by other notable Angelino designers of that period, but Peters was responsible for the lower 2 floors. Probably the most famous image of this, the one that some of you may know, is for the sports department with this extraordinary mural by a Serbian artist, Stojana is his name. And typically, this is put into books, if it ends up in books at all, as, well, Art Deco, American Art Deco, West Coast Art Deco. But I want to show you some other images of the same interior, which suggest, well, something maybe not quite what we'd expect. Because although the elevator doors here look very much like, well, what elevator doors would have looked like in New York buildings from 1929, the floor is a little unusual for that period. But even more interesting are many of the other rooms. This is the beauty salon. And look at the wonderful way he's worked in the linoleum here. Or the extent to which this falls in a different category. I don't think most of us would look at this and stylistically clump this into Art Deco. We'd probably put it into something closer to an American International style idiom. Yes, no. I mean, the labels are a funny thing, but one can see how very different this is. Or this, for example, this is the manicure area, which shows even more marked and kind of lovely reduction with that same play of linoleum. I'm obsessed with that linoleum. Or, for example, what he did with fluorescent lights, which is really interesting. He grouped them and brought them around the edge of the soffit and up the wall, which is a really interesting thing. There were a number of write-ups of this building that focused on the lighting and how innovative it was for that period. Yeah. Or here, one of the mirrors. This was sold in New York not so many years ago from one of the women's departments. Or here, the radiator cover from the men's department. Or what I first saw when I thought this was a desk. It turned out to be a display table in the men's department. So when we keep the shirts or socks in the drawers and so forth. And again, it's important to recall the date here because almost all of this was designed in the very end of 1928 or early 1929. So quite prescient, quite interesting, and really quite lovely. I think we'd all agree. But Peters was so remarkable. He was designing houses in this period, this one not built, but in its formal language, honestly could be a house that could be built today in Los Angeles and would not look out of place. I love the way he played with perspective here, but though giant plant in the front, nearly as big as the house. Not something very many architects would do because you're not selling the plant, you're selling the house. The extent to which this is both volumetric and visually difficult is probably a good word, visually manifold is really interesting here for this period, because this is actually the end of 1926, early 1927, so very, very early. You have to remember what, for example, Schindler and Neutra are doing at this period. So this predates the Lovell Health House, which is pretty remarkable. No one thinks about that. Peters went on to do several other shop interiors, including most notably this one for a company called Hollander, which was on West 57th Street here in New York. It was a thin, tall, sliver building, and he did all of the floors, working with Eleanor Lemaire, who was a quite well-known shop designer from that period, interior designer. She by this time was living in New York. He'd known her because they'd worked together on the Bullock's project before. The drawings for this are extensive and they're wonderful because they detail everything, including the livery, the car design. I love this, the shoebox. And I show you this because, in one sense, this also represents a kind of Gesamtkunstwerk. So the idea of designing literally everything for the store. But it's also worth noting, if we go back to this interior, the extent to which this is kind of pluralistic in its intentions, pluralistic in its stylistic gestures. Because I see all of the 20s in here. Again, I see constructivism, I see futurism, I see the style. It's all there, as if he's taking it all and reusing it, rehashing it, remaking it. He would do much the same in another shop he did. It's for Irene in Los Angeles, a very exclusive store. She had been actually one of the lead designers for the films. Does anybody know who she is? She was the wife of Cedric Gibbons. Yeah. Quite a notable pairing in Hollywood in that period. Extraordinarily beautiful thing. Or here, he went back during the Depression years to work for Paramount again. You can see his ankh here. It's always sort of recognizable. It's sticking in most of the drawings. And this was, as you can see, for a nice New York penthouse apartment. We all want this apartment. In an idiom that's different again. Because one of the things that I can say about Peters, and you, again, I've only seen a small percentage of what there is, he's a stylistic chameleon. And he changes incessantly and in very interesting ways. And it goes on, because he designs first one house in West Hollywood in this period. This is it. This is a kind of language that would be not so different from Schindler in this time. It's not quite Neuter, because it's not clean enough to be a Neuter design. Looks a little more like Gregory Ain from later on, interestingly enough. But then he went on to do all that. That looks like it could be in Miami Beach. With its round window. And there's the interior. And then his own house in Eagle Rock, which was not completed because he died. Literally sitting at his desk in 1934, he dropped dead. Finally, the TB had caught up with him. He'd lost the use of most of a lung in World War I, so he was a man with one lung, and that can only last so long with a heart. And so he dropped dead in 1934. He had a rather short career, 1889 to 1934. Well, the narrative I've been able to piece together, not so easily, especially the German part, because a good bit of that trail had gone cold. But I know quite well where he was, what he was doing, who he was working for. It's a very interesting story from the German side, because in one sense, it's a kind of capsule history of German modernism, particularly as it relates to the area in and around Hamburg. In the Los Angeles context, maybe it's less typical. Weber's career in Los Angeles was more typical than Peters was, for example. But nonetheless, it's certainly a tale of American modernism, and an uninteresting tale of American modernism, I think. But I'm left with this. I've written most of this book, but I've not written the introduction, and I've not written the conclusion, because I don't know exactly what to say about Peters. You saw at the beginning that I actually have a Peters. By the way, I just want to show you one other thing. This is extraordinary. And that's, instead of drawing this in plan the way this is normally done, he drew it in perspective, such as a kind of axon, which is a very unusual way of drawing this, because he was just so inventive. And lastly, he worked with Schindler on a project called Park Moderne. This was going to be a whole town of modern houses in what's now Calabasas, which is the new sort of cool place to live back behind Malibu. They built a few of these, and then it didn't succeed. Though it doesn't look particularly Schindler-esque at this point. So I started trying to think about what all this means and how I package this, because in the end, it's nice to write a narrative and it's nice to do a monograph, but in the end, one has to say what one thinks about all of this. What does this mean in the context of American modernism, or indeed German modernism, or more broadly? And so the working title I have is Jock Peters and the Varieties of Modernism, which seems to be apt, but it's a nice, clever title that doesn't get me very far. But it does raise a kind of interesting stylistic problem, and more to the point, it raises a historiographic problem. And that's, I think, what I want to do today for us as a discussion. The historiographic problem is this. What do we do with someone like this? What do we do with a designer or an architect, or both, who never develops a style that's recognizable? never becomes someone with an idiom where one says, oh yes, I know who that is, immediately. And if we think about it, almost all the really well-known modernists fall into that category. We see a Mondrian, we know it's a Mondrian. Even if it's on a bad, if it's on a purse or a dress, it's color blocking, oh, that's Mondrian, we know that's Mondrian. If it's a Wrightian gesture, even if from the different phases of Wright's career, we know it's Wrightian. If it's Miesian, we know it's Miesian, and so forth. I would submit to you that one of the reasons that Peters is not a particularly well-known figure nowadays has to do with the fact that he's so difficult to pigeonhole. It's probably reason number one. Reason number two was his archive was sitting in a mesa in Colorado, in the middle of nowhere, and nobody saw it. But it does raise an interesting question historiographically, both about whether a figure like this has value for the larger discourse that we have about modernism, and if so, what the value might be. Because we could argue, well, in places he seems to be very original, and in places he seems to be derivative. And he seems to be borrowing. It's very clear, for example, in the one Wrightian house that I showed you. By the way, there are a number of them. Is that interesting? No, not particularly, except that it's in Germany and it's rather early for that. But the question becomes, what's the meaning here? And I would love to hear your reactions. Be enormously helpful for me. Pat?
Well, I do think it's important historiographically, and even in our BGC survey book, we were really absolutely determined to talk about many modernisms, and often had titles like that, partly hoping to sort of shift people's heads away from thinking. But
don't when we talk about many modernisms talk about many figures, as opposed to many modernisms in one figure?
Well, I think that's much more, was going to be my second point, that I think you have as many modernisms and you have a multivalency in terms of that. But also, I get what you're saying when you say we always know that's Mondrian, but not necessarily if we're looking at a kind of earlier one or something. And certainly when you're teaching, say, Charles Rennie Mackintosh, whose work goes in maybe 5 or 6 quite distinct categories, even if you take general art historical categories. And you do get students going, well, that can't be Mackintosh, and you go, well, it is. Deal with that, and actually
deal with it, I like that.
That's why I think that Peters is such a great case study, because what you're saying is you deal with that. And I don't think there's anything wrong with somebody who moves around. In the 1820s, most British architects and European architects expected to be, even if they're designing a building that's Gothic revival, they'd be doing neoclassical or whatever. They could do that. And also, I just think this, he has such a pictorial facility, he's so good at drafting things. It seems to come fairly easy to him, and I think if you maybe think about somebody who has that facility and has that ease, and it's well, I guess you can't prove it. How does he get to having that ease with so many different things? And I keep thinking about even Zeisler was around the Hamburg just a bit later in that, that they don't go for what we think of as orthodox modernism, and I think we just don't know the richness really of that period, either of Germany or anywhere.
So that's one argument I thought of making, which is simply this shows us a richness that we've tended to ignore.
Absolutely.
And I think there's an argument to be made for that. I think it's also is interesting for a figure who's this facile in this many ways. And what I find so interesting is not just that he's stylistic, so pluralistic, sorry to put it that way, but that he renders in so many different ways. He'll render one way on Tuesday and the next day on Wednesday, entirely differently. Usually for architects, they render one way for a decade, and then they might render a different way the next decade. But not with Peters, it's whatever he had for breakfast. Seems to have informed his rendering technique.
So, but on that point, what do you know about his training? Do we know?
Well, I know he had a funny training. He was trained as a stonemason from a very good master in Hamburg. Then he went to night school in Hamburg, to not very, it was essentially a kind of contractor school, the Baumeister, the German word Baumeisterschule. And then he went to Dusseldorf, which was not one of the premier schools because Behrens had come and left. Behrens had been there, as you may know, but Behrens had left and the school had sort of slipped back by the time he had come. So he did not have a cutting-edge education necessarily. He then went to work for Behrens later on, and then the other man he worked for, Benzel, was a rather good architect.
And I guess I'm asking because in that sense, I mean, maybe he was just, pragmatist.
I think he was pragmatic at some
He's a
level.
man who's plying his trade and doing whatever he needs to do to carve out a living. I mean, that doesn't make an exciting book, but...
His letters would suggest that I'm an artist and I'm doing all this because this is part of artistic freedom.
And
So
actually,
there
when you look at the stuff you expect, in a kind of simplified way, you expect his training to be the fine arts. That's what I would think, if you project backwards, what's so interesting is that he isn't, and it's just a pity there's no family history of his childhood drawing and making things from 5, which you usually get with a portfolio like this.
And I truncated this a bit because I didn't say that he had been quite facile as a child drawing. And he was closely related to the Hamburg Secession group. So he was in a group of artists, even though he was the architect and designer within the group. So you're very correct. Astute as always.
That makes sense. It just makes sense, doesn't it?
Those of you who know me are not going to be surprised by this, but I was really struck by the gestures towards transparency and dematerialization, and I was thinking, although it's probably an artificial red thread maybe, but I was thinking that what's very interesting to me is not, it's interesting to me that he's doing this early, as you point out.
Quite early.
Yeah, definitely. Although, although there's, if we think about, Cologne, 1914, and Bruno Taub's Glass Pavilion, and we think about Shearbar. Yeah, but this idea of the visionary, this is expressionist.
Sure.
But I think what's really interesting to me is a kind of a wrestling with this, right? That to me almost strikes me as a principle that even when in the other drawings of interiors you showed for the films that weren't made, that there is a kind of an opening up of space and a dematerialization of space, but there's also a resistance to that at the same time.
More resistance than I showed you today.
But I think even in the drawings for the house projects later on, that's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing a kind of push-pull of opening to the outside and breaking down those boundaries, but at the same time, the strong resistance. I even see it in some of the, the electrical lighting and kind of playing with reflection and surface and texture, but at the same time, like shutting down those passageways. And I wonder if there's a story to be told there about a kind of a, we're so used to these narratives of progression toward transparency. Here we get to the Bauhaus, and we've somehow arrived at something.
He seems to walk away from
transparency. But I think that's, if you want to talk about modernisms, is there a modernism that wrestles and that plays with and that doesn't go?
And that's why I'm playing with this title, because it allows me to do that. Varieties of Modernism suggests that it's not just stylistic or superficial, but it can be also has to do with sort of deeper approaches to meaning and use and so forth.
Yeah. I find that really fascinating.
So I think you're absolutely right. I think what you say is it's kind of necessary but not sufficient to tell the story. So necessary is part of the story, but not entirely sufficient because so much else is going on in this work.
Right.
Yeah. I was struck, still struck every time I see it, with the one image I showed you from Mars where you should read through the ceiling. You can't tell you how rare that is in architecture.
But it's so fascinating because the ceiling's there.
The ceiling's there, but you read the building above it. Yeah.
And do you know how much work he did in the movie industry?
No, because he was an assistant art director. And in that period, the art director always took credit. So if you look at the credits, it's always, what was the man's name? Dreyson, very famous art director. His name's always on the film, whether Peter's designed it or not. I've been able to identify, I think, 9 films he worked on. And not more. And given the amount of time, he worked for famous players Lasky from 23 to 27, and then Paramount again from 31 until he died in 34. So in that period, Paramount was making 2 movies a week.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
there could have been quite a few. And there's no way to know because of the way that they credited. The art director was always credited, not the assistants. I went actually to the archive in Los Angeles and the Academy, and they were helpful up to a point, but not really.
I mean, occasionally, just occasionally on, the Internet Movie Database, people add in just where they have information,
Mhm.
that I know somebody puts inside and stuff like that. And I was a bit wary too, I don't know how accurate it is, but they do seem to have a really good team who do that. It's just worth checking back occasionally, but it doesn't sound like there's going to be many leads to Peter's, whereas there might be more leads to other people.
What tended to happen is he kept the drawings for the films that were made. Because the films that were made went to the production department and they drew all over them and they threw them away.
Yeah.
And so, alas, the drawings that I have are the ones for the films that were made. There were 1 or 2 exceptions, but for the most part, the drawings that have survived are not the drawings for the films that were made.
But it's still, sorry. No, I was just going to say, in terms of the films, the 2 that you showed anyway, and I don't know what the other 7 are like, but, I'm just wondering also if he was really brought in for particular ones, that had some sort of very modern agenda going on, and maybe it was, it's just this, again, it's another hint or suggestion that maybe he had a reputation in that.
He clearly had a reputation. People knew who he was. One of the ways I know that is that when he decided to leave famous players, he was briefly employed by a kind of who's who of other Hollywood designers. So he worked briefly for Ken Weber. That's how I knew about him in the first place. So everyone knew who he was. My guess is, given the way that Hollywood worked in those days, is he worked on some plum jobs and he worked on some not so interesting things, where he literally was just slinging pillows. That was the nature of the business.
I don't know if you said or if I wasn't paying enough attention. When did he go to Los Angeles?
He arrived at the very end of 1922.
And so he started working in the industry in 23.
End of 23. So he worked in between for a German-speaking architect. He knew almost no English when he arrived. So he worked for a German-speaking architect for the better part of a year. He learned English, and as soon as he could, he got out of that job because he was working as a draftsman and went to work for famous players.
So, I'm just thinking, so this time in Hollywood and working in the industry is kind of core, in a sense, of his practice, probably. And these other things are the periphery of it. In terms of his day job. Versus, starting the furniture company with his brother and.
But 27 to 31, he was out on his own. So he was doing. He did a lot of shop interiors. I didn't show you all of them. He was quite well known for doing shop interiors in that period. It's just how he came to do Bullock's, and also Hollander here in New York. He was remarkably prolific. I'm sorry.
Sorry, did you say how his work came to be in Colorado?
His son would live there. His son. So his son was a man named Jock, who was the son of Jock Peter's oldest daughter, her name was Ursula. And she married a sculptor, a Dutch sculptor named Jan de Swart, a fairly well-known figure in Los Angeles, who happened to be the purchaser of the first house in Parc Moderne, in the housing development. So they bought, the story goes that he bought this wonderful little modern house in Parc Moderne, which in those days was well outside of Los Angeles. And was so enamored of it, he went to go find the architect. And he found out the architect was living in Eagle Nest. He drove all the way to Eagle Nest, which is 1,000,000 miles in Los Angeles, knocked on the door, and Jock Peterson died a few days before, but met his very fetching young daughter and married her.
Is that one of the stories you learned?
Isn't that great? Yeah, I love these things. They're really great stories. When I interviewed the son had told me some really interesting things that I was very dubious of because they didn't make any sense. The son had told me that he had been a conscientious objector during the war, And they told me it had been gassed, which didn't make any sense. And they told me that it had been imprisoned. Imprisoned, gassed, and conscious subjector all in the same way. It didn't quite work out. One of the things that I found going through the thing, I found his army record. And it tells me, almost to the day where he was and what he was doing. He was a conscious subjector. The parents had told us that story to the children when they had arrived in Los Angeles because there's so much anti-German sentiment then. That if Daddy was a conscious subjector, he couldn't be a bad Hun, and therefore you could go to school safely and not be picked on by the other kids. But they believed that the other family apparently believed it to their last days. They'd be Daddy been a conscious subjector. He just hadn't been on the front because of a TB. They didn't want him to infect the other soldiers, so they sent him to a munitions plant. They had requisitioned a number of Belgian factories to make munitions. And he had worked because of his background in foundry work back from his stonemason days.
So I have another question. I mean, again, understanding we're only seeing a slight...
Yeah, a snippet, like half an hour snippet.
So, are you considering him an architect, or are you considering him more of a designer, interior? I mean, because it seems like if he was a designer for the Hollywood films, it's more designing a kind of fantasy set, designing a commercial interior for the department store. It's more design work than architectural.
I would say both
work.
and. Both and. I made a career out of writing. Joseph Frank was both an architect and designer. Paul Frankel was an architect and designer. Ken Weber was an architect
But
and designer.
I'm just thinking in terms of the balance of his...
With Peters, it depends on the part of his career that we're talking about. There were points at which he was very much exclusively an architect, and there were parts of his career at which he was really only doing what we would consider the design work.
And how do you estimate it from that archive? Because what you don't know is which commissions he worked on a lot, and he could have then designed furniture or whatever. But, I don't know that you can quantify, but it's a good thought. My other thought is something that I don't think will have any relevance, but when you're talking about World War I and Germany, I mean, the moment he goes into the film industry is when they make a lot of films in Hollywood about the war. And there's probably no connection, but it's just something I think to perhaps keep at the back of your mind. There's a lot.
Again, I didn't tell you this, but...
Try to come to terms with the war, so that would make even more sense of this.
The most famous film he designed, I didn't show you the stills because I had half an hour, was a film called What Price Glory from 1926. It's a very famous film. He did the entire designs for that. And they've survived. They're lovely drawings. But they're fairly conventional war scenes.
But he didn't get credit for that.
He was not credited in the film, but we have all the drawings and all in his hand with his unk, so there he is. But so you're correct about that. That he was part of that world. Dreiser, who was his boss, had been working for UFA before he came to the U.S.
So was he part of that German community in Hollywood?
Yes.
Yeah.
Very interestingly, where they lived is not very far from Caltech. So they were friends with many of the famous German-speaking scientists at Caltech. They would have coffee clutches on Saturday afternoons for all these quite famous German scientists. They also knew the Webers very well, because the Webers were living very close to there as well. Coffee clutch. Well, this is such a German thing, right? Sunday afternoon coffee clutch. So he was very much part of that world.
Yeah. So you might get some little snippets from those memoirs and things.
I think not much. I didn't find much. I found more from his papers about other people than vice versa. Mercifully, this is a family that threw very little away. So I have his tax returns from 1930, 31, 32. I have all the letters that he and his wife exchanged during the war. I have the baby spoon, and it's crazy stuff that came to me. It was all faxed to me after the son died, so it's really kind of wonderful and perverse what came out of those boxes. So I have a lot of information. So, in terms of his biography, I know very well what happened. But this is a question, as I like to argue with my students, what we do as historians is we preserve the past, and then we make meaning out of it. Right? That's fundamentally what we do as historians. And then making meaning for this particular project I found difficult. Because somehow I can't quite land on that thing. Is it simply a story about pluralism and how we haven't really quite accounted for pluralism in the history of modernism? Maybe. But again, I'm sitting with a lot of very wise people, and I'd love to hear what your response is to this.
Maybe you have to rely on more than one thing. I think it's just that you have to.
So what are the other things? So it's a story
Well,
of...
one thing is, I think when you're talking about the Hollywood community in that period, is that there were long established traditions of various immigrant communities that once they got there, they stayed clustered together. And that ranged from everything from, New York intellectuals who travel out at the beginning of sound to, what happened during the silent period when every German director who made it then brought with them all the people they had known. And those communities in themselves become part of what that then assimilation process of being absorbed into the studio system, which was really something that produced extraordinary work, but didn't encourage a collectivized approach. So it wasn't unusual at all that someone wouldn't be credited. That was the nature of how that system worked. And there's something about thinking through to what extent was what he brought with him from Germany, how did that get transformed in Los Angeles at that period? There are really interesting questions about assimilation, small A assimilation, that I think can come out of when you don't have an actual answer, a hard answer, but what was the zeitgeist? What was it that was...
In the end, he assimilates and doesn't assimilate. That's the funny part about it. It's not as if he's one of those tales of pure assimilation. He's not Billy Wilder, who becomes, as American as American can be. He's not that story, exactly.
I wonder,
Oh, go ahead.
just for a sec, I wonder if, almost just, I feel like I said this phrase 12 times this week, so I don't know the wrong way, but just pan out, just to step back, let's say, from the smaller questions, or those sort of, I could almost imagine a chapter by chapter sort of, like case studies in the modernism we don't know, right?
Yeah.
So this is one way in which he is in doing something different. But I wonder too if one of the bigger framing questions, which you maybe already are assuming, is what is the value of, for lack of a better word, incoherence? Or, what is the value to the study of the history of modernism, to not just something that maybe appear anti-modern or not consistent, but to a kind of a inconsistency. Like, how do we deal with that? Why should we deal with that? And I think maybe it's part of a question about, a cynical question, which I'm not the bearer of this question, so don't shoot the messenger, but a cynical question would be like, well, he's not me, so to hell, right? It's like, why, but I think it's a much more important question than that.
I had an early title that was a flippant response to that. It was called Jock Peters, Modernism and Messiness.
Right. But what is the benefit?
Or it was messier than we thought.
Or maybe,
But actually,
But everything is. I think you maybe even start from that and just say the historians have been really stupid. Link that.
Well, I don't know if I'm going to make everyone happy with me like that, but...
Well, no, but because inconsistency is in the eye of the beholder, and it's in the head of the historian, so looking for X or Y. And we do teach the most narrow, ludicrous paths through our subjects. And this is to me why this is important, because you can't, if you do this justice, and I think you are already doing that, then you can't take that, you just can't use the images and go, there you are, and here's a story, and people get this kind of wrong impression, And actually, I remember Saul Bass sort of saying to me that after one of his film titles, somebody wrote and said, well, I couldn't say anything that was Saul Bass about that, and you say, well, too bad, if you're trying to tell it. If you're trying to sort of summarize a story that's different, West Side Story is radically different from a cowboy, and I think the thing here is frustrating for you.
It's not frustrating, it's just I haven't quite hit the
But you
point.
also don't know the stories behind so many of these, what to me are hugely interesting projects. And I think if you did, it might, the multivalency might just be easier to kind of pour out.
If I had to be snide about my own career, I'd say I've made a living about writing about designers who don't fit the canon.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's very.
But this really doesn't fit.
Guardian.
What I was going to say is, instead of emphasizing the fact that he didn't really have one particular style, the facility that he had in all these different types of styles, the fact that he was trained in a trade initially, maybe he came here until he connected with, you know, the kind of community that would give him a chance. He did whatever was required, so he could adapt to doing more of this or less of that or whatever it was. And maybe also to help his brother make a living, so they started these furniture things or this or that, based on the tradesmen, you know, the trade skills that they had back in Germany.
Yeah.
So that was a way for him to, you know, make a life for himself in a foreign place where whatever was required, he could jump in and, you know, fit the bill, sort of. So maybe emphasizing that skill as opposed to one particular style, one particular thing that he becomes so known for, and emphasize the versatility of somebody with obviously a lot of skill in various areas.
I think there's some real truth in that. It comes back to the question I think that we raised a minute ago about value. In other words, how do you value a designer like this? A jack of many, many trades, maybe a master of a few. There are a few things that are really pretty stunning in Peter's work. But is this a minor figure? I mean, it's always the risk when one writes about someone that's not known. I'm writing simply about a minor figure, and you know, my book immediately goes to the remainder rack.
But I think,
Well-
you know, I think if you don't have value, you know, in a way that the more material culture approach is just to see everything, for me, is of the same value. And I understand what you say. Actually, one of my favourite books, my own, I don't know that anybody reads it. It's been out of print for many years, but, you know, somebody called Harry Peach, who wasn't even a designer,
Yeah.
you know, and that's what you saw, he wasn't even a designer, it's like into various things. And in a way, I think that may happen because, you know, it's a bit like Jock Peters, Harry Peach.
Yeah.
The first question is, who the hell is he?
Yeah.
Right.
I was thinking of it from a curator's point of view, and Pat
Yeah.
as well,
Yeah.
working at the Wilsonian with a lot of things that were not by
Yeah.
niece,
Yeah.
their own designers. And the same thing, it's sort of like, I think, Freya's idea of a kind of case study, because you find things and you say, well, this is not the best thing I've ever seen, but it does tell a story. And so you have to tell, you know, put it into its context. And I think that context is part of what we've heard already, is this thing of an emigre coming to America, going to Hollywood, having different kinds of opportunities, making a living. So it's not a heroic story, and like you're saying, the value. Well, it's not, maybe it's not a heroic story, but there's a story there that's worth telling, at least in this day and age of not just following the canon and creating good
Yeah, that works at some level.
He's got a really
Yeah,
good
no, I'm just, you know.
It does have a good bag of
Yeah,
chips.
so-
But it's interesting, if I look at the responses to Bullock's, when Bullock's was completed, it was a big deal. It was all over the design media, everywhere. So people recognized the skill set that he brought to it and how good it was. And I only showed you a snippet of the 2 floors. But it was very, very good. And so in one sense, I can't simply write him off as being, well, not an important figure, but certainly he was perceived that way in his own time. 1928, 1929.
No, I mean, I think it fits in, and I mean, in a way, it's wonderful that you found it, because actually you know those contexts in terms of the architectural and design background of LA now probably better than most, and so I think you'll do a really good job with it.
I learned a whole hell of a lot about Hamburg I didn't know. Somebody who spends most of his career working in Vienna is about as far away in the German-speaking world as you can get from Hamburg. In fact, I had to learn some new words because there's some odd words in German speech. He writes to his wife in Plattdeutsch when he's trying to be funny. So not standard German, but in Plattdeutsch. And I have to say that was a challenge reading some of those letters.
I think we're kind of running out of our time. Does anybody have anything else that
But I'd be, if you have burning things to say before you run out of the room, I'd love to hear it. Because I still have to write, I feel like the last chapter and the introduction and conclusion of this book. I started this book and I wrote 2 other books in between, and I came back to this thing. So it's in part because I didn't know what to do with it, part because other things were more pressing. Everything I heard today was helpful. The case studies thing.
Well, since you've already written most of the book, though.
Well, no, what was my initial idea was to do a case studies approach. Because you're very smart, and I thought, well, case study, I just do this as a series of case studies, but it didn't really work very well. It didn't work very well because everything was so cheap by jowl with him. He'd do one thing in 20 seconds. I mean, literally, the next morning he'd eat something different for breakfast, and something else would happen. Several of the projects he did in the late teens, he did the same project in seven styles, or 6 styles. He did exactly the same project, but he'd say, oh, what would this look like if Mendelssohn did it? Oh, yeah, well, okay.
Well, that's fascinating.
One of the images you showed reminded me of Pulsing.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. There was more of that, but I didn't show you.
The other thing that just flashed through my mind then was, it's not the model for you, but when Fiona McCarthy did this more biography really of William Morris, I mean, it's almost sometimes you think you should go hour by hour. But there is a really important thing you gain by that, which is of somebody who is doing a lot of things at once, and you don't get that sense unless, I mean, your introduction, I think, if you don't do it somewhere else, to get that sense over somehow, either in the chapters or in your intro.
May I ask the group one more question? Is there a style, a historiographic model for this? Can you think of another book that does something like what I'm suggesting? Because I couldn't think of another book that exactly played with pluralism in such a deep and profound, deep and broad way. What do you think of one? I couldn't think of another book historiographically that would work quite that way. Which means that I'm going to have to write it
like
down.
Nash or something, I would go back to.
Which one?
I was just trying to think of something on Nash in the early 19th century, but I wouldn't think it was probably dealt with it because it's very long ago,
I couldn't come up with anything. Anyway, I thank you very much for your time and attention.
The other thing is, actually, I think we think happily about eclecticism in the 19th century, and we tend not to think about it in the 20th century.
That's right.
It's everywhere,
And this is a kind of modern eclecticism, although in a funny way. Because he doesn't typically blend styles. So it does occasionally too, but he doesn't blend them necessarily.
No, that's why I think it's more that facility with other styles that you'll find in the early 19th century. That would be my place of kind of work.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.